What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 16 top 36 wide receiver rankings. I've already posted the running back, so if you haven't seen that one, take a look at that after this one. But it's all about the wide receivers. Before I do dive into tier 1, I want to run through a few players that I'm not going to have ranked, just not super confident they're playing this week. So a few studs: Drake London, Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson. For London and Wilson, I just don't see why the teams push it. They didn't seem super close last week, so just not anticipating it here in Week 16. Devontae Adams seems like he will miss a couple of weeks. And then Marvin Harrison Jr., Christian Watson, Roma Dunze. For Marv, just don't have a great read on it. Also just want to rank Michael Wilson highly. Christian Watson dodged a serious injury, but certainly could miss this week. And then Roma Dunze re-aggravated that foot. But looking at tier 1 here, these are your studs: JSN Puka facing off Rams versus Seahawks, Amon-Ra St. Brown coming off a monster game, and then Jamar Chase, a nice bounce back in Week 15. So those four guys are in tier 1. Then looking at tier 2, I've got Nico Collins going up against the Raiders. Since Week 10, he's averaging 19.4 points per game. It's a good matchup against the Raiders. They're allowing the 7th most points per game to the wide receiver position. I think this is a game that is going to get ugly. I think the Texans' offense will look good, and then I think they're also just going to completely shut down the Raiders' offense. Up next, CeeDee Lamb going up against the Chargers. Now, on paper, this is not a good matchup. Chargers defense has been really tough against opposing wide receivers, second fewest points per game allowed. But this is CeeDee Lamb. I still like the Cowboys passing attack. Then I've got A.J. Brown going up against the Commanders. Week 15, only 2 targets, but in his previous 4, he had seen at least double-digit targets, 10 plus. Decent matchup, 11th in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. I do think this is a solid bounce back opportunity for A.J. Brown. Wasn't even a terrible Week 15 because he did score a touchdown. At wide receiver 8, I've got George Pickens going up against the Chargers. He's been a little bit underwhelming back-to-back, 5 for 37, 3 for 33. I'm not super panicked. I know there was like the effort concerns in Week 14. Didn't see a ton of that in Week 15. I think this is just like a slow stretch, tough back-to-back performances. At wide receiver 9, I've got Michael Wilson going up against the Falcons. And admittedly, I was a little bit nervous heading into that Week 15 game. He was someone that I ranked a little bit higher than consensus. He had just been an absolute monster without Marv, but it also was just a really tough matchup against the Texans. And I felt like I answered, like for start-sit questions, I think the most common name I answered to actually play was Michael Wilson. So I was hoping he wouldn't go out there and completely flop. Had a really strong game, so I felt good about that. And now we have a 4-game sample size without Marvin Harrison Jr. He has put up 33.5, 21.8, 37.2, and then 16.4 PPR points. And then I like the matchup against the Falcons, 10th in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. And as I'm actually hearing myself talk, I think I probably should bump Michael Wilson up. So I'm actually going to move him up to wide receiver 7, going to put him ahead of both A.J. Brown and George Pickens. At wide receiver 10, I have Jameson Williams going up against the Steelers, and he had a really rough start to the season. He has been an absolute monster ever since Dan Campbell took over play calling. He scored at least 16 PPR points in 6 of his last 7 games. In his last 3, he has put up 26.9, 17.3, and 26.4 PPR points. He's been targeted 29 times in his last 3 games. I like the matchup here against the Steelers. I think at this point, Jameson Williams has to be a must start. Another guy who I think is probably a must start, especially given the matchup, Chris Olave going up against the Jets. In Week 15, 6 receptions for 85 yards and a touchdown. He scored at least 14 points in 4 of his last 5 games. This Saints offense has been kind of banged up, but Tyler Shuck looks good. Chris Olave is producing, and this Jets defense, post-trade deadline, has just been pretty brutal. Now, moving into Tier 3, I've got Jalen Waddle going up against the Bengals. Waddle's coming off a pretty brutal Week 15 game. If you survived his Week 15, congratulations. I do think, though, it is just a good matchup here against the Bengals. Like the Dolphins, despite looking terrible offensively against the Steelers, according to Vegas, they're tied for the 3rd highest implied point total, all the way up at 26. Waddle has scored under 9 PPR points in 3 of his last 4 games, but I think this is a great bounce-back opportunity here against just a really awful Bengals defense. At wide receiver 13, I've got Mike Evans going up against the Panthers. Awesome to have Mike Evans back. he just looked awesome. It wasn't a full-time workload, only a 70% route participation. He was the wide receiver 3 in snaps. They were kind of running like a wide receiver by committee, also with McMillan getting back in the lineup. But Mike Evans balled out, 12 targets, 6 receptions for 132 yards. It'll be interesting to see if they kind of bump him up to just like full-time starting wide receiver usage, or if they still kind of ease him back into the lineup. But either way, I think he's right in like that fringe wide receiver 1 area. At wide receiver 14, I've got T. Higgins going up against the Dolphins. We'll see if they bring him back. I wouldn't be shocked if they just kind of shut him down with him having his second concussion of the season. He was limited, all throughout practice last week. Didn't end up playing. If he does play, I think he's a high-end wide receiver 2, but there's no guarantee that he does suit up. Then I've got Rashee Rice going up against the Titans, and it's always tough to like figure out where you're going to rank these like elite fantasy producing wide receivers once their quarterback goes down. Patrick Mahomes, very unfortunate with the torn ACL, but Rashee Rice had been, a high volume target earner, 9.8 targets per game this season. It's a good matchup on paper against the Titans, top 6 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but you are going from Patrick Mahomes to now Gardner Minshew. My overall take here is I think Rashee Rice will be fine. He's probably not going to be super efficient. He's not going to have the same touchdown upside, but I still think he's going to get a lot of volume in this offense. It's not like this team has an amazing run game they can fall back on. So higher end wide receiver 2, I think is kind of a fair spot for Rice. Up next, DK Metcalf going up against the Lions. This is a great matchup against the Lions. They are top 3 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. I think they might be actually number 2 at this point. And then DK Metcalf, not coming off a crazy game. He did have a awesome touchdown catch, but they're 7-point dogs in this game. It's a good matchup. I think the passing volume is going to be there. I think DK Metcalf will have a very strong performance. Another guy with a really strong matchup, Jawan Jennings going up against the Colts. Week 15, didn't command a ton of targets, but 3 receptions for 37 yards, got into the end zone twice. He scored 6 touchdowns in his last 6 games. Ricky Pearsall likely going to miss time again, unfortunately. And then, like I mentioned, great matchup. Colts, 3rd in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. And then my final tier 3 wide receiver is going to be Courtland Sutton going up against the Jaguars. Coming off a big week 15, 7 for 113 and a touchdown. He has scored at least 9.9 PPR points. Weird cutoff, but he did have a game there in 7 of his last 8. So in the middle of the season, he wasn't having like these super high ceiling performances, but he was still staying steady. Had one of those big games against the Jaguars, or no, was not against Jaguars, against the Packers. And Bo Nix, like that had to be his best game as a pro. Courtland Sutton definitely benefited from it. Not a great matchup, but I think he'll be fine. He's been solid as of late. Now moving into tier 4, I've got Wan'Dale Robinson going up against the Vikings. He's definitely a little bit lower than usual. It's not a good matchup. Vikings actually allowing the fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. I do still think like Wan'Dale just has a very high weekly floor, 8+ targets in his last 6 games, and then he is the wide receiver 15 in points per game. At wide receiver 20, I've got Zay Flowers going up against the Patriots. Finally got into the end zone, his first touchdown since all the way back in week 1. 3 receptions for 68 yards and a touchdown. It was just a super low volume passing day out of the Ravens. Flowers almost had a second touchdown, a ball he probably should have come down with, but I think this is just kind of where he's settling in. He doesn't have a super high weekly ceiling, but the floor has been pretty consistent week after week. Wide receiver 21, I've got Terry McLaurin going up against the Eagles. Since he returned to the lineup, he went 7 for 96 and a touchdown, 3 for 41, and then 3 for 69 and a touchdown this past week. It's not a good matchup. Eagles, 8th fewest points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but he's a talented player. Mariota has proven to be very capable coming in here as the backup. Then this next player, I really considered ranking him lower. Ladd McConkey going up against the Cowboys. He's been straight up unplayable. He's been awful in the last 4 weeks. He's combined last 4 games, 10 receptions for 84 yards and a touchdown, but he gets the amazing matchup against the Cowboys, who are allowing the most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. I think this Chargers offense can finally look competent. I believe in the talent. I believe in the player here with Ladd. Obviously, I'm very high on Justin Herbert. And so in this matchup, I do think Ladd is playable. Hopefully I don't regret it. Like I said, he's been rough, but like back end wide receiver 2 with the great matchup. I think this is a fair spot to rank Ladd. At wide receiver 23, I've got Jacoby Myers going up against the Broncos. Not a good matchup, but Jacoby Myers has just been extremely productive. These are his stat lines in his last 5 games: 5 for 64, 4 for 50 and a touchdown, 6 for 90 and a touchdown, 4 for 39 and a touchdown, and then 5 for 71. This Jaguars offense is clicking. Trevor Lawrence has looked awesome over the last 3 weeks. So even in a bad matchup, I feel like Myers is fine in like that fringe wide receiver 2 territory. And then the last guy in this tier, Tedero McMillan, going up against the Buccaneers. He's just kind of been odd these last few weeks. The volume just hasn't been there. Like last 3 games, 2 for 35 and a touchdown, 1 for 43 and a touchdown, 2 for 25. This is a guy who early on in the season wasn't getting into the end zone, but he was giving you, 5 for 60, 4 for 70. Now he's scoring touchdowns, has a big play here or there, but the volume just hasn't been there. I'm still a believer in the player. I think the volume should bounce back, back end wide receiver 2 for me. Now moving into a pretty large tier 5, I've got Devonta Smith going up against the Commanders, and he's also been pretty rough. Under 10 PPR points in his last 3 games, under 10 PPR points in 4 of his last 5. He has not gotten to the end zone in his last 5 games. I still like the player. I think it's a plus matchup here against the Commanders. I do think this is a nice bounce back spot. This is just a really interesting mix of guys. You've got some players who haven't really been this high in the rankings, and then also just like some very talented players who haven't been productive. After Devonta Smith, I've got Jaden Reed going up against the Bears. This is assuming that Christian Watson is going to be out with that shoulder injury. And Reed had a solid game in Week 15, 6 targets, 5 receptions for 55 yards. I do think if Watson is out, he's like the clear most talented wide receiver in this Packers room. And so if he's getting those wide receiver 1 looks, like him as a high-end wide receiver 3. In that same matchup, I have Luther Burden. This is obviously assuming Rome Odunze is out, and he is dealing with an ankle injury, but last couple of weeks, he's looked really solid. Week 15 specifically, only ran 16 routes before leaving with that injury, but he was targeted 7 times, caught 6 of them for 84 yards. If he's healthy, I do think he's a very viable wide receiver 3 play. And then sticking in the division, kind of crazy, I have Justin Jefferson ranked below Jaden Reed and Luther Burden, but that's just where we're at this point. It does look like a great matchup on paper. Giants 4th in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but I said the same thing last week. I was like, Jefferson's been rough. I cannot sit him going up against the Cowboys. I just can't do it. And I was wrong. Another really rough game. Him and JJ McCarthy have some of like the worst chemistry I've ever seen. McCarthy will miss them, and then Justin Jefferson will just drop a ball that you fully expect him to catch. In the last 3 weeks, Justin Jefferson has combined for 6 receptions for only 37 yards. And so even in a tough matchup, I just don't see how I could rank him higher than a fantasy wide receiver 3. After Jefferson, I have BTJ, who looks like he's bouncing back after a really rough start to the season. In his last 2 games, 3 for 87. This past week, 4 for 66 and a touchdown. Seems like the Jaguars are just letting him play outside, not come over the middle a ton, which is where he found a lot of issues early on in the season. Jacoby Myers just dominating the middle of the field. It's not a good matchup against the Broncos, but he's a talented player. This Jaguars passing attack has looked great. I think mid-tier wide receiver 3 is a pretty reasonable spot for him. Then I'll actually talk about these 2 players together. Emeka Egbuka is going to be my wide receiver 30. Chris Godwin, my wide receiver 32. Egbuka had a nice bounce back game, 7 targets, 4 receptions for 64 yards. Nothing crazy, but like it had been rough. He hit 10 PPR points. We did see Baker, though, miss another big throw to him late in that game, potentially to ice it. A nice chunk play that Egbuka does not have on the stat sheet. It was interesting, though, kind of taking a look at the usage. Like I mentioned with Evans, it was kind of a wide receiver by committee. Egbuka only a 63% route participation. Chris Godwin was actually the guy who led there clearly at 95%, but he's not commanding volume at a crazy high level. This past week, 4 receptions for 20 yards and a touchdown. He has been getting into the end zone, so he's barely hitting 10 PPR points. Last 3 games, 10.8, 10.5, 14. I think having these guys in a similar range is fair. Godwin's routes are going to be there, but at this point in their careers this season, I do just think Ibuka is going to be the more productive player. Then sandwiched between those guys, I have Troy Franklin. Now I want to, make this clear that this is assuming Pat Bryant does not play. If Pat Bryant is back, I don't have a ton of interest in playing Troy Franklin. We had seen Franklin kind of start to build, have some nice games, week 7 through 11. He was averaging 15.1 points per game, but then we saw Pat Bryant kind of overtake him in snaps, routes. With Pat Bryant out, Troy Franklin bounced back, 6 receptions for 85 yards and a touchdown. So I think he's a very viable wide receiver 3 if Pat Bryant is out. If Bryant is back in, not a ton of interest in playing Troy Franklin. And then moving into the 6th and final tier, I'll start it off with DJ Moore. The usage has been there from a route perspective, 94% in week 15, came through with 2 touchdowns, 4 receptions for 69 yards, got into the end zone twice. His floor is just very low, where in his last 6 games, he has scored under 5 PPR points in 4 of them. After DJ Moore, I've got Michael Pittman going up against the 49ers. And from the Colts overall team perspective, I think the Phillip Rivers experiment was fine. They're in a very close game against a very good Seahawks team. For Michael Pittman and these pass catchers specifically, it wasn't great. Phillip Rivers, 120 passing yards, 1 touchdown. Michael Pittman has now gone under 30 receiving yards in 4 of his last 5 games. So tough to feel super excited. Still a player who could potentially command volume. I think he's hurt less than a guy like Alec Pierce, who does need those big downfield plays. But Pittman, back end wide receiver 3 for me. Then I have Adonai Mitchell going up against the Saint, former teammate of Michael Pittman. He's just commanding volume, 6+ targets in his last 5 games. He's had 2 big games in his last 3 where he put up 24.2 and 17.4 PPR points. It certainly doesn't feel great trying to bet on this Jets passing attack. But at this point, they've got no one else to throw to, back-end wide receiver 3. And then the last guy in these rankings, Khalil Shakir, he had been the consistent, safe option. That hasn't really been the case as of late, but he had a fine week 15. At this point in the wide receiver rankings, there's way more injuries at wide receiver than running back. So it feels gross, but with no London, Adams, Wilson, Marv, Watson, Adunze, it's kind of slim pickings towards the back end here in tier 6. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 36 rankings. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe. Check out the running backs, posted those earlier today. Quarterbacks, tight ends, defense is coming out tomorrow. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.